Welcome all, this is Corey with Coney Builds, and today I'm going to be doing a build guide on the Nerf Meowser. This is a blaster that is largely based off of the Meowser C96, obviously in Nerf form. You have a couple different options in terms of power, whether it's semi or full auto, and a few more customizable options outside of that. This one in particular is going to be a DL-44. You can purchase the files via Old Fusion Designs on blasterdownloads.com. Now it's worth noting that there is two file sets for the DL-44 specifically. You will have to purchase the Meowser as well as the DL-44 files, but in my opinion, I think it's worth it. While you're there, you should definitely check out other models that OFD offers because I've played with quite a few of them and I actually enjoy them quite a bit. Today we're going to be using the hardware kit that you can get from outofdarts.com. This one was purchased by myself. You have a few different options for which hardware kits you choose. This one in particular is going to be a solenoid with Lokis and Pulsar mini wheels. This setup will net about 161 FPS with a 32.5mm cage. Keep in mind the FPS can vary depending on what type of darts you use, what kind of battery, what charge level, etc. It's also worth noting that the hardware kit that Out of Darts provides will have enough hardware for the DL-44 extra bits. If you use high torque motors like Lokis, Krakens, Fangs, or any other high speed or high torque motors for any flycore systems, I strongly recommend you purchase motor dampeners as well. These are little silicone spacers that go on top of the motor when you install it. Unless you have really short motor screws, which I can't seem to find, if you don't use the motor dampeners, the screw will actually bite into the coil of the motor itself, which will cause your motor to malfunction, and in some cases, burn out. All of the parts I used and all of the filament I used will be listed down below in the description. In terms of print orientations for the parts in the 3D printer, it's pretty straightforward. These are paid files. Inside the file set does a pretty good job at telling you how to print specific files. I will say I did have one issue with this grill piece that goes on the front of the magwell. Unless you print it out with some maximum supports, there's always a part of it that'll shift and then it causes basically the print to look terrible. Other than that, the print orientations for the included parts is pretty good, and supports aren't terrible for any of this. As for what tools you'll need, I'd recommend a basic metric screwdriver set, as well as a size 0 Phillips head screwdriver. Obviously you'll need a soldering iron and some solder. I'd always recommend a good pair of flush cutters, some pliers, and you'll definitely need a file and or Dremel. You will also need a hobby knife, wire strippers, silicone lubricant, thread locker glue, and super glue. This isn't required, but I'd strongly recommend a pair of diagonal cutters or side cutters. And as far as any 3D printed blaster goes, I recommend having a deburring tool. The Out of Darts hardware kit comes with some heat shrink, but I always recommend having some on the side as well, and some electrical tape, just to be safe. For this particular build, we are using a solenoid, but we're going to make it full auto with a blinker relay. There is just enough room in this build for it, but I strongly don't recommend it unless you have a Dremel. And you can completely do this build without it. It's just something different I wanted to try specifically for this build. I would also recommend getting a set of helping hands as well as a brass insert heat set, but as you'll see throughout this video, I didn't use either. I filmed this a few months ago and I didn't have my full setup, and you can do it this way, but it'd be so much easier if you had both of those things. So let's get on to the build guide. First, I'm going to prep my 3D printed parts by putting in all the brass inserts. As I said before, you're going to have enough hardware in the hardware kit for all the brass inserts in this kit, even with the DL-44 expansion. You're going to want to use the file and the X-Acto to clean up the parts after you put in the brass inserts. There's a couple areas where you definitely need to make sure that you file down excess plastic, especially within the magwell. Double check the fitment of parts to make sure everything goes together or moves together as it should. Once that's done, we can go ahead and start with wiring up the fly core. We'll start with the motors. Every time I do fly cores, I do this little trick with used darts. I'll take two of them and cut them down to just below the dart stem and have them about the same length, make sure they're flush. Next, I take the motors out of the hardware kit and then I put the dart bodies on the motor shafts. What this does is make sure the wiring between the motors is the right spacing, and it also makes sure it's consistent and it doesn't move around too much. I take whatever's left over with the dart pieces and I use it as a spacer between the motors to keep them from adhering to each other. Next, we'll take the 18 gauge wire and measure it out between the motor terminals. Once you have a good enough length, you're going to cut both wires. You're going to take your wire strippers and strip the shorter wires about halfway. Next, you're going to strip off about 1/4 of an inch of each of the longer wires. Next, you're going to take your hobby knife and you're going to split the inner copper of each of the longer wires in half. Then you're going to take your smaller wire and then wrap the copper of the longer wires around the smaller ones like so. Before you go too much further, make sure you cut off a piece of heat shrink that'll cover this exposed copper. Go ahead and solder the shorter and the longer wires together. Cut off any excess wire that is wrapped around the smaller wire. This will make sure there's no sharp edges and it doesn't tear through the heat shrink. I don't have a working heat gun right now, I just use this lighter to melt the heat shrink over the exposed copper. You're going to repeat this step for both the positive and the negative wire. It doesn't necessarily matter which side is positive or negative, just make sure the red dot on the motor is opposite. You can figure out polarity a little bit later, which I'll go into. Next, you're going to strip the smaller wire for the motor terminals. Make sure there isn't too much excess wire between the motor terminals. Leave a small amount for some vibration slack. I personally like splitting the copper on the wires 2 times, so you have 3 separate strands. I give them a good twist to make sure they don't come apart. The middle set of strands will go through the hole in the wire terminal. Once you get that in, twist all 3 of the strands together. Once that looks nice and strong, go ahead and solder it down. Same process as before. Make sure you cut off any excess. And make sure while you're soldering that you don't get any solder on the motors themselves, or that the wire has any contact with any part of the motor itself. You're going to repeat this whole process for all 4 terminals. Now what I like doing is making the positive and negative go opposite ways. That way the wires don't run into each other. Once you've made all your connections, you can go ahead and remove the foam from the motors. Since we're using Lokis with this build, we're going to go ahead and install the motor dampeners as well. These just go on top of the motor shafts, in between the motor and the flywheel cage itself. Next, you're going to take your motor screws and put a bit of thread locker on them. Next, you're going to take your Phillips head screwdriver and install the motor screws onto the motors. Once you have all 4 of your motor screws installed, you can go ahead and install the flywheels. Now, it's worth noting there is some flywheel spacer tools. These are available in the OFD Flycore Straight Talon file set, which is on printables, also linked down below. Make sure your flywheels spin freely and that they're level with each other. If you're following the wiring guide closely, you should be good on polarity, but it doesn't hurt to check. So what I like to do is strip off the ends of each positive and negative wire. I keep a low power 2S battery handy to make sure both flywheels are spinning opposite directions and make sure they're spinning the correct way. If everything looks good, go ahead and feed the wires through the wire channels on the Flycore. Next, we're going to go ahead and mount the solenoid. Make sure your solenoid comes with this little diode, you'll need that for later. The solenoid will mount to the Flycore with 4 M3x8 socket head cap screws. This is where it's important that you have a pretty long dedicated metric driver because it'll go all the way through and actually screw in the solenoid. I find it easiest to get the screws in first and kind of rock them in. This part can be a little bit tricky. You need to make sure that you can put the top shell piece over the solenoid and the wires. Old Fusion Designs recommends you use some electrical tape to tuck the wires into the actual solenoid. You can also wire in the diode and make sure it's in this little pocket. Make sure the gray line on the diode actually faces towards whichever wire you want to be positive on the solenoid, otherwise the solenoid will not work. I decided to put my diode outside of the solenoid just to make sure the top shell can go over everything. Now we're going to install the mag release into the Flycore. You're going to take the mag release 3D printed part and slip it into the slot below the solenoid on the very bottom of the Flycore. This next step is optional, but I very much encourage it. You're going to take the spring used for the magazine release, and I would cut it down a few coils. Of course, I don't recommend doing this unless you have a pair of cutters. If you don't, it's usable, it's just not the greatest. So if you cut down your spring or if you're leaving it as is, go ahead and install it into the Flycore. Check to make sure that it moves freely. While we're at it, we're going to install the trigger spring as well. I did the same thing where I cut off a couple coils just to make it a little bit more comfortable to use. This next part of the build is completely optional. This is where I install the flasher relay for the full auto solenoid. In my experience, I found this to be pretty slow for full auto, but it is true full auto with a solenoid. So if you want to know how to install it in this particular build, I will show you how. Link down below is the specific blinker relays I used. They come with this outer shell that you will need to break off. I just used some flush cutters to break the outer shell. Most of the white plastic on the bottom part of the blinker relay can be cut off. Just make sure you keep track of which terminals are which. We'll come back to that a little bit later. Next, we're going to take the back cap of the upper shell, apply a little bit of super glue to it, and attach it to the upper shell of the Meowser. Once that's done, we'll move over to the switch plate. Make sure both switches align with the little indents on each half of the switch plate, as shown here. Sandwich those 2 parts together. These 2 parts will be secured with a 10mm toy screw. While you have the switch plate, make sure you break off the normally open tab of the larger switch. You can do this by bending it back and forth. Then you're going to bend the normally closed tab on the switch, just enough so it doesn't make contact with the solenoid or the solenoid spring or any other wiring. Now this is the trickiest part of the entire build. You need to make sure you have enough slack for the wires, but you also want to make sure you don't have too much slack, as you won't be able to close the shell with all of the excess wire, especially if you do the blinker relay full auto. You're going to cut the positive wire on your circuit to length and solder it to the common tab of the larger switch. make sure you heat shrink this particular connection. Make sure you have your negative and positive marked in your solenoid, and you're going to take the negative wire and solder it to the negative wire coming off of the motors. Once you do this, the negative will be completed for the circuit. If you're using a flasher relay, make sure you solder the positive on the solenoid to the L side of the relay. Solder the rest of your positive solenoid wire to the B side of the relay. If you're not using the relay, you can skip this step entirely. If you are continuing to use the relay, make sure you cut out enough of the plastic underneath the solenoid in the fly core to accommodate the relay. And if you get everything to fit, make sure you wrap it with some electrical tape so nothing comes in contact with anything else on the build. As you can see, this is quite a bit of effort, so I'd only recommend this if you're an experienced blaster builder. Next, you're going to take the positive wire from your solenoid, make sure you got the right length and cut it. You're going to solder this wire to the normally open tab on the trigger switch or the smaller switch. This should be the middle tab. Since the holes on these terminals are pretty generous, you can actually just strip the wire and put it straight in. This will make it easier to solder. From there, you're going to start a new wire path. You're going to take what's left of your positive 18 gauge wire, and you're going to solder it from the common terminal on the trigger switch, which should be the top terminal, to the normally closed tab of the rev switch. I personally like to make it so it's one continuous wire, so I bend it where it makes contact with the terminal and strip it there. If you're going to do it this way, make sure you have the heat shrink on the wire and make sure it loops through both sides of it, like this. This part particularly can be pretty difficult without helping hands, but as you can see here, I was able to do it relatively easily, but make sure you're careful and you don't burn yourself. Once you've done that, you can go ahead and melt the heat shrink over this terminal. As I said before, this is probably one of the most important ones to put the heat shrink on. Once you have finished that and you verified that you don't have too much slack on your wires, you can pull both the positive and the negative through a wire channel that's on the switch plate. If you want, you can actually heat shrink these two wires together to keep them the same length, and we'll come back to that in a little bit. Next, we're going to install the mag release. This is two pieces that go in the lower handle piece. Once you set the larger piece in, you can screw it into the smaller piece with a 10 or a 12mm toy screw. Make sure it moves smoothly. If you want, you can apply a little bit of lubricant to make sure it moves even smoother. Now we can mate the upper with the lower part of the shell. You will have to do a little bit of finagling to make this work. Make sure your trigger and trigger spring are already in the blaster. You'll need to feed the excess positive and negative wire through the trigger and bring all the parts together. You might need to poke the wires a couple times with a screwdriver or a flathead of some sort to get everything to seat down properly. If you haven't already, you can install the right side grip with an M3x8 button head cap screw. Now you just need to solder the positive and negative to the XT30 and you are completely done with the wiring. Now we can begin the final assembly. As I said before, you will have to finagle with the wires a bit to make sure everything seats together properly and make sure none of the wires get pinched. Real quick, we're going to go ahead and put on the left side of the grip with the battery door screw, and this is where your battery will go. Next, we're going to install the top shell piece. There's a little plug for the solenoid that you can push in to keep the solenoid from springing out under the shell. I like using this to give me a little bit of support. As you're putting the shell back on, make sure the wires aren't getting in the way and tease them back in if you need to. If everything goes to plan, the solenoid should spring freely. Next, you're going to put on the side plates. If you're not using a fidlock panel, you can secure these with the M3x8 screws. But if you are using a fidlock, this will take an M3x12. We're going to go over to the right side, and this is where things are going to get a little bit different. If you are doing the DL-44 specific one, you'll need to put on the side panel. This one has two holes for brass inserts, make sure you install those. This will be screwed in with the M3x12 screws as well, even though the official build guide recommends thumb screws. The included screws will work just fine. For the scope ring, there's two different files for it. There's one that's just called scope ring and one that's called scope ring 1-inch. For the included scope files, this is just the scope ring file. If you want to use your own scope, this will be the scope ring 1-inch. Attach the lower part of the scope ring to the scope mount. These will be M3x8 screws. Next, you're going to assemble the scope itself. Make sure you take the scope sight piece and place it into the side with the female threads. There's a little notch that'll line this up perfectly. Next, you'll screw the two pieces of the scope together. Make sure you printed out 2 of the scope ring pieces, and you'll mount the scope with 4 total toy screws. These will stick out a little bit, but once it's all together, you'll barely notice. Next, you're going to take the front magwell greeble. This is the piece that I mentioned you'll need to have full supports on, and you're going to glue it to the front of the magwell with some super glue. You could probably mount this with some hot glue as well, but that's completely up to you. Now, in terms of barrel options, there's one that is exclusive to the DL-44 set, and it's the shorter barrel. Alternatively, you can use either the standard Meowser barrel or the longer barrel, but I wouldn't recommend either of these outside of for cosmetic reasons. They tend to reduce accuracy by a considerable amount, but for this particular build, I'll just use the longer barrel. This is secured to the main body with 3 M3x8 screws. If you're using a longer barrel, there is a part for the front sight. You can install it if you want to. I think it looks better with the front sight. Now, I completely forgot to put the M3x8 screw in the front of the shell. Now, once that's all done, you can thread on the DL-44 muzzle, or a different muzzle if you so choose. And that's it. You're pretty much done. If you have any questions or need any more clarification on any parts of this build, don't be afraid to drop a comment down below. And if there's any particular blasters you want to see built next, go ahead and let me know down in the comments. Now, with all that being said, like the video if you like it, subscribe if you feel like it, and have a blast!